My name is Derrick Shore. I'm the co-host of Houston Life on KPRC2. And more than 20 years ago, I went on assignment in a submersible to the bottom of the ocean to see the wreckage of the Titanic.
Fewer than 100 people have seen the wreck of the RMS Titanic with their own eyes. On this day, I'll become one of them, and I'll take you with me.
I was a young reporter, I was 19 years old, and my boss told me that I was going on assignment to go see the wreckage of the Titanic. At the bottom of the North Atlantic Ocean, more than 12,000 feet, 2.5 miles below the surface. And the assignment was exciting, but I also knew it was going to be a challenge. I knew that I would be in this submersible for 12 hours with no bathroom, with a little lunchbox with food and some water, but 12 hours in a mini sub this size is not a comfortable trip, but it was the adventure of a lifetime. There were 3 of us on this sub in very tight quarters. It was me, my producer John, and our pilot Jenna Chernayev. Jenna speaks fluent Russian, doesn't really speak English. John and I speak English, we did not speak Russian. So there were 3 of us on this sub in very tight quarters, and we really had no means of communication. And John and I, who spoke English, we didn't know how to operate the sub. And it wasn't until we were on the ocean floor I realized, oh wow, it might have been helpful if we'd had some training on this. We didn't have a contingency plan. And so if something went wrong, we knew that there were huge risks. We had a general idea of what this experience would be like beforehand. Knowing that there would be no bathroom on board the sub, we kind of tried to slow everything down in the days leading up to our trip. So we weren't drinking a lot of water, we weren't eating a lot of food, because while there is a plastic bottle on board underneath the seat, nobody wanted to be in that situation. No one wanted to use the plastic bottle. So I remember the morning we went down, and my mother was so nervous. She was back home in Salt Lake City, Utah, hoping and praying all day long. But we took a boat from St. John's, Newfoundland, and we were at sea for a day and a half before we reached the surface of the North Atlantic, where we would be going straight down to the Titanic. Once we got to that spot, we boarded a large research ship. It's called the Keldysh. And on board the Keldysh are 2 mini subs, submersibles, Mir 1 and Mir 2, the same subs used in the Titanic film by James Cameron. We boarded one of the subs early in the morning. We had life jackets getting in because the boarding process is a little bit tricky. And once we climbed in through the hatch, which is a small opening in the top of the submersible I went in, they cranked that hatch and we were in there. The shape of our submersible, while it looks elongated, the actual passenger compartment is a sphere because that is the strongest possible shape. So when you have the pressure of the ocean compressing that sphere, that's the safest possible scenario. Our windows were 9 inches thick. And the moment we were sort of craned off the ship and placed into the water was bright blue. It was beautiful. And then they flood what are called ballast tanks. So we had these big air tanks underneath the sub. And once those were flooded with water, we were free falling down to the ocean floor. It took 2 hours to free fall and reach the bottom. It got dark very, very quickly, within just a couple minutes of getting into the water and starting our descent. And the deeper we got, the colder it got. And every second we were dropping meter by meter until 2.5 miles and 2 hours had gone by.
Jenna kept an eye on how fast we were dropping. The temperature was dropping too, so we all put on more clothes. Finally, we landed on the bottom.
I think that means we're here.
Then I saw a very familiar shape. It was the bow of the RMS Titanic.
It's hard to imagine that this is it. This is the Titanic. Seeing the Titanic on the bottom of the ocean for the first time, it was truly magical. I was feeling all kinds of things because I remember as a child in elementary school in the 80s is when the wreckage was discovered on the seafloor. Robert Ballard discovered the wreck in the 80s, and that was the time when I was in elementary school. And I remember reading books about it and studying about it in school. I think many of us have this fascination with the Titanic. Of 2,200 people on board, 1,500 of them, passengers and crew members, died. And so, as fascinating as the journey was for me, it's also very haunting to realize you're visiting the gravesite of so many people who died. So to describe what I was feeling is difficult, but it's a ship that so many of us are familiar with, and I couldn't believe that what I was seeing outside of my portal was the one and only Titanic. Part of our expedition was to retrieve artifacts. So underneath the submersible I was in, there was a large basket and these robotic arms. And we were actually retrieving items. The salvage company, which owns the wreck, part of these expeditions are to retrieve items. And so some of the items we ended up bringing up were part of the traveling expedition of the Titanic. At one point, after we had been flying around the ship, we started with the front of the ship, and then we moved to the back portion of the ship that is separate from it, and there's a debris field between it. At one point, our submersible was having issues. We were having mechanical issues. And because I do not speak Russian, and Jenna, our pilot, does not speak English, we weren't really able to communicate about what was going on. And on his radio, he was also speaking Russian, so we couldn't hear what the person on the other end was saying. But we noticed we had lost power on one side of our submersible. Previously, when we had been flying around the wreckage, we did so with ease. But at one point, the left side of our sub seemed not to be working. And so we were sort of leaning to one side. And a couple times even, our pilot, Jenna, reached over and kind of banged on the wall, banged on the instrument panel. That was not a good sign. And in that moment, I remember thinking, okay, what do we do now? Is there going to be an issue getting back to the surface? We weren't tethered. We were 2.5 miles down. I knew we had limited oxygen supply, and I wondered what would go wrong if we lost power entirely. At that depth, there are very few pieces of technology that can, first of all, reach you, but secondly, tow you back to the surface. And we had a long time to think about this because we were disabled for a while. Finally, our pilot gave up, and he flooded those ballast tanks with air so we could resurface, which took about 3 hours. But I can tell you, after those mechanical problems, the moment I knew we were done and we actually were able to start going back up, that was a huge relief. I knew that this trip was dangerous when I did it. I didn't realize just how dangerous it was until I was back on the surface. One of the scientists on board the research ship that we were on for a couple weeks during this whole expedition explained to me that at that depth in the ocean, imagine 150 million pounds of ocean crushing down on a mini sub. I can't imagine how the families are feeling right now. The entire world has been holding their breath the past few days, wondering about these 5 passengers. The way it was explained to me after my own trip to the seafloor is that if there was any problem with the sub, a hairline crack, a breach of the hull, you'd be dead before you knew it. You would essentially incinerate. That's the way a scientist explained it to me. And that's maybe the better case scenario for these souls on board. A lot of us have been worried that maybe they were stuck underwater with no communication and no power, no way of getting back to the surface. And I can't imagine what that would have been like to be stuck for days. But it sounds like that is not what happened. I don't think there was any time to suffer. I don't think these passengers had any time to even realize what was going on. I've done a lot of really interesting stories over the course of my career, and the Titanic was such a fascinating trip for me. I would never do it again.